Welcome, everyone. I'm Helen Joyce, the Director of Advocacy for Sex Matters, and here with me for this webinar on sex, gender and the law in schools is Maya Forstatter, the Director of Sex Matters, Alistair Coverley, who's a specialist education lawyer, and Shelley Charlesworth of Transgender Trend. So we're delighted to see you all at this streamlined, updated presentation of the school's guidance on sex, gender and the law that was put together by Transgender Trend and Sex Matters. And you can download it from the Sex Matters website if you go to resources and then to publications. Now, this guidance was produced with specialist lawyers in equality, human rights and education law, and we have also seen other people's guidance on this issue in schools, both publicly available and privately. And so we do have a very, very high degree of confidence in our analysis in this, but we should say that the Department of Education is also working on its own guidance. And when that comes out, of course, we may need to make some small adjustments to what we have here. Our order of business for the evening is this. I'm going to start by running through a slide presentation that's a slimmed down version of the school's guidance. I'll take about 20 minutes for that. And then my panelists will return for a Q&A. And I'll start with my questions, but I will add in the questions that people put in the Q&A. So some housekeeping. We've set the Q&A to be open to everybody in the audience. That's so that our questions wrangler can see the questions. And there's also the chat where you can just be discussing with each other what's going on. And can I ask that if anyone tries to derail the chat, just ignore them. They'll stop faster that way. After the slideshow, it'll be most of the rest of the hour will go on the Q&A, but I'll save the last few minutes to hand over to Maya, who'll tell you what Sex Matters is up to at the moment, and in particular to give you a sneak peek of what's coming up for us in the education space. And she'll finish out the webinar and say goodbye to all of you. All right, let's get on with the slideshow then. Right, so what the background to all of this is that more and more kids are saying that they're distressed about their sex. Schools are both causing this in part, in our opinion, but also having to deal with it. So Sex Matters commissioned YouGov back in February and found that 79% of secondary school teachers said that their school had at least one pupil who identified as either trans or non-binary, and about the same share said that the number was increasing. So this guidance is needed really by pretty much all schools. It's directly targeted at schools in England. We are working on guidance for schools in Wales and Scotland, although that's not that straightforward. Okay, so if we the next slide, we'll look at what the principles are that we used in putting together this guidance. So these are the three things that schools have to do when they're thinking about really any issue that's to do with sex or gender in schools. So the first one is that you always start with an approach that supports safeguarding. That's the single most important issue in schools for anything. And the second principle that runs right through this guidance is that you review all your policies to avoid discriminating between boys and girls in general, whenever you can. If you do that, that's good practice anyway, because you're avoiding sex discrimination, but it also makes it easier to accommodate children for whom their gender is an issue, because you don't have unnecessary distinctions of gender. And the third principle is that when you do have sex-separated aspects to the school curriculum and environment for admissions, rules, facilities, and so on, you can justify them. Right, so our next slide explains what you need to know before you start any of this, and it seems a bit ridiculous to have to say that, and that is that you need to know what sex is. So 10 years ago, none of us would have felt that we had to say this, but we all know that we do now. So the legal meaning of sex is the same as the ordinary meaning, male and female. In the Equality Act, there's an extra characteristic, gender reassignment, and that protects gender-distressed children from discrimination, and not just children, everybody. It does not mean that they need to be treated as the opposite sex. So when you're thinking about what sex means in schools, it's the thing that you always knew it meant. A male child who identifies as a trans girl or female is still a boy, he's still male, but he has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and so on. A child who identifies as non-binary or any other gender identity is legally and physically still the sex that they actually are. And no law requires you to treat any pupil as if they were actually a member of the opposite sex. Now, you also need to know what discrimination is. So there's two sorts of discrimination, and I'm sure that Alice will have more to say about this later on in the Q&A. There's direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. So direct discrimination is when you actively treat somebody less favourably, well, not actively necessarily, you treat someone less favourably because of a protected characteristic, and that's unlawful, unless it's specifically covered by an exception in the Equality Act. Indirect discrimination means that you do something that on the face of it is the same for everybody, but it puts people with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage. So on our next slide, I'll show you two places where sex discrimination is okay. Sex-based rules are okay. They're okay for privacy, fairness, or safety. So schools should separate the sexes, for example, in using the toilet, when getting changed, and for fairness and safety in sports. That's direct sex discrimination, but it's acceptable. And you can also discriminate between the sexes, or distinguish between the sexes, in order to increase equality of opportunity. So that might be a program that's specifically intended to encourage girls into STEM subjects, or to encourage boys to consider careers in care. So that's two examples of direct sex discrimination that are both lawful. And a lawful example of indirect sex discrimination might be something like saying that primary school kids had to turn up in shorts or trousers. That's less convenient maybe for the girls who probably have a wardrobe that has more skirts in it, but you could justify it. You could say it means that kids are able to turn up ready for rough and tumble play. And on the next slide, we have another instance of direct sex discrimination that is lawful, and that is in admissions. Girls' schools and boys' schools are permissible, and a girls' school can exclude all boys, and that includes the boys who identify as girls, and vice versa for boys' schools. This does not count as direct discrimination based on gender reassignment. It's expressly allowed for. But if a girls' school were to say that it would exclude a girl who identifies as a boy, that would be discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment and not acceptable. Now, the law says that single-sex schools may admit a child of the opposite sex. The example that's given is a staff member's child, but they're not obliged to. Okay, so a child who has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment will be a child who has issues of some sort with their gender. They might be questioning, they might be distressed about it, they might identify as trans or non-binary, and they are covered by the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. They're also, of course, covered by the protected characteristic of sex. They have both those protected characteristics. And when deciding how to deal with them, schools must consider both their interests and the interests of all their peers. So if they don't apply, for example, normal safeguarding, and this is when we come back to our first principle for which we used for this guidance, if they don't apply normal safeguarding to children who identify as trans, that would actually be discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment. Now, when we did our survey, we discovered that a lot of schools are actually doing this, no doubt unintentionally. So a lot of schools have equality and anti-bullying policies, which are often described as trans-inclusive, but they actually weaken risk assessment and safeguarding. And some of them do it inadvertently for all their pupils. For example, they make it harder to assess and act on risks that pupil faces or poses to others. An example might be a policy that says that you're not allowed to tell parents about a child's trans identification or anything linked to that unless the child gives you permission. Many things linked to a child's trans identification may in fact be safeguarding concerns. For example, if you discover a child is considering buying hormones online, or a child is using a binder, or a child is talking to strangers online, these would be serious safeguarding issues, and a policy that treated the child differently because of these things would be discrimination against them on the basis of gender reassignment, as well as a major safeguarding risk. And some of these policies also don't say that children aren't allowed to misgender, aren't allowed to discuss these issues, aren't allowed to say things like, there is a boy using the girls' changing rooms. So they're actually silencing the children about safeguarding risks as well. So a lot of schools are doing this, and it's a problem. And in particular, a major issue is when they're supporting social transition at school. So most of you, I think, who are listening to this webinar will know about the Cass review. So Hilary Cass, who is the eminent paediatrician that the government has asked to look again at gender services for children in the NHS, she said one of the most interesting and useful things she said was that social transitioning, which is changing a child's name and pronouns, is a major intervention. It's basically a mental health intervention or a medical intervention because it changes the path of gender distress. And schools aren't clinics. They aren't healthcare professionals. So our strong recommendation is that schools should avoid attempting to diagnose mental health problems, which is what they're doing if they say that a child is trans. And they should instead work with parents and everybody else related to the child's care to support that child. And that would mean that they would not use a name and pronoun for a child that they kept secret from parents, which we hear increasingly that schools are doing. And they should also avoid any actions that might entrench a trans identification at an early age, or that risk discrimination or harm to other children, such as telling a trans-identified child that they can use the facilities of the opposite sex. So the standard approach to parents when it comes to risk assessment and safeguarding is that you would normally expect to work with parents. They would be part of the child's care. You would not shut them out. You would only do that after a risk assessment that suggested the parents themselves were an issue. And so that's why I think so many of the trans inclusion policies that we've seen are really going badly off the rails on safeguarding. Well, a specific safeguarding failure that a lot of these policies recommend, and it's arguably discrimination on grounds of gender reassignment, comes to do with toilets and changing rooms. So what the Department of Education regulations say is that schools must give separate toilets for boys and girls over 8. And that means with a full-length door, not gap at the top and bottom. Ideally, it would have the hand-washing facilities inside. What they were imagining when they wrote this was a single unisex toilet that might be disabled access as well. Some schools now have full-length doors, but the sinks are outside. It's possible that they just creep in under the regulations, but they're not ideal and we wouldn't recommend them. And they must also have separate changing rooms and showers for boys and girls over the age of 11. So the recommendation from both us and from the Department for Education and the EHRC rather than the Department of Education is that if there's a child who finds it too difficult to use the facilities for their own sex, it might be appropriate to arrange single-sex a separate private changing facility, for example, the staff changing room or another suitable space. Schools shouldn't ever breach their policies on single-sex accommodation and risk assessment for sleepaway trips. There's a specific issue that comes up just because gender questioning children are involved. That would be a safeguarding failure. So our next slide looks at a specific issue, which is that schools are supposed to teach children about consent. It's an important part of the curriculum and it's supposed to run right through it. All pupils should feel that they are able to speak when they feel at risk, or they feel ill at ease, or they feel uncomfortable, or they see something that they think is wrong. And so it's important that a child of one sex who sees a child of the other sex coming into a space that they're not meant to come into doesn't feel that they can't say that they can't say what the problem is. And it's important that children aren't encouraged to overstep the mark on this. They aren't encouraged to overstep other children's boundaries. A child who uses facilities that are intended for the opposite sex is actually intruding on other children's privacy, even if that's not at all what they meant to do. The most important thing that a school needs to do is to make sure, as best they can, that a gender questioning or gender non-conforming child, does not feel ill at ease in the facilities that are intended for them. One thing that we really do need to start saying to schools that if you tell girls that they must accept a male child in female-only spaces, that could be sexual harassment. It's not intended as that, but it could be. As the next issue that I'd specifically want to discuss is belief. So religion or belief is another protected characteristic, and that includes all the well-known religions, but it also includes beliefs about gender identity. Ever since Maya won her case, gender-critical beliefs are protected in the Equality Act. And that means that you cannot discriminate against somebody who makes the simple statement that there are two sexes and that matters. And schools can't discriminate against their pupils because of either their beliefs or those of their families. And it may be discrimination to force pupils or staff to espouse particular views about gender identity or to deny the material reality of sex. It would also be discrimination on grounds of belief if you made it impossible for somebody who was, for example, Orthodox Jewish, not to say what they need to say about the two sexes in order to practice their religion. And in general, schools have a statutory duty to promote fundamental British values, which you'd be delighted to hear include an acceptance of other people having different faiths or beliefs to oneself or having none. So this should run through everything that schools do on the issues of sex and gender. Now, freedom of speech is a particular issue, which is related to belief, but not only belief. It is important that people feel able, respectfully, politely, and at suitable moments, to describe the world as they see it and experience it. And schools should make clear to any gender distressed child and to their family that it's not an affront, as we often hear, to their humanity or their very existence if the school or any other institution makes a clear distinction between biological sex and feelings of gender identity. And the school should also enable people to maintain boundaries and bodily privacy, which will include recognising the sex of other people and set rules relating to sex that apply to everybody and doesn't enter into individual negotiations. Okay, so all of that really related mostly to safeguarding. But if we move on to the next slide, what we'll remember is that our second principle was to do with reviewing policies that distinguish between boys and girls. So in general, it's good practice to do this only, well, it's also legally important, but it's good practice to do it only when it's necessary. So if you look at traditional sex-based distinctions, for example, in the subjects that pupils study or the games they play or the clothes they wear or the names they use, if you avoid these, you will both avoid sex discrimination and you will make it easier to weave the life of children who have gender issues or are gender non-conforming into the ordinary life of your school, because there's just less for them to stand out about. And don't emphasize children's sex unnecessarily. Some schools say, queue up to come in after break in girls, or just the girls one side and boys the other, or to have girl-boy seating. Really downplay that distinction when it's not important. And then when it is important, make sure you can justify it. So if there's something that you want to do, an activity, behavior, hairstyle, item of jewelry or clothing, and you say that it's acceptable for one sex, it should be acceptable for the other, except when it actually matters. So the next slide does suggest some places where it will matter, because my last 3 slides cover 3 specific situations that schools have to deal with. And the first is to do with teaching science. So the basic thing about teaching science is that it should be factually accurate. So when you're doing any class in school, the facts about biological sex, which we all know in humans is binary and immutable, that should be clear. And schools are also barred by regulations for schools on promoting partisan views. So they're not meant to seek to further the interests of one group or to advocate to change the law or government policy. And they should avoid materials, I think we're going to be talking about this more with Shelley, they should avoid materials from external groups that undermine factual, age-appropriate teaching about sex, biological sex, with ideas of gender identity. So neither your curriculum nor your policies should enforce these particular ideas or reinforce harmful stereotypes, as we see so often that this idea of gender identity actually in practice is gender stereotypes. So the next slide is to do with PSHE and RSE in particular. So there aren't set syllabuses for these, and there isn't any list that the DFE produces of acceptable providers. So schools really are on their own. They are given some guidance, but this is, I think, where we see a lot of the problems. The general guidance says that information children receive about sex should be accurate and age appropriate, and they should leave school with a proper understanding of the importance of equality, respecting and understanding differences, and that includes differences in religion, belief, or sexual orientation. Some schools have taught children that gender identity overrides sex, but local authorities have withdrawn those materials whenever they're challenged. Now, schools are allowed to separate children for anything to do with, for example, the facts of life, what puberty is about, and so on. And they do this for a good reason. It's justified, which is that they want to allow children to talk freely without embarrassment about their bodies. So obviously a child who's experiencing gender distress may need special consideration here. It would never be appropriate to put a child of one sex in a single-sex class for the other sex. It would also never be appropriate to say they can't go to the lesson for their own sex, but you may need in conversation to talk with that child and perhaps address that part of the syllabus separately with them in individual support. And finally, sports. This is the very last special consideration, the special place where we're going to have to allow sex separation. And the reason for that is obvious to anyone who has been through puberty and has tried arm wrestling with someone of the opposite sex, which is that boys are considerably stronger than girls on average. And really, most boys are a fair bit stronger than most girls. So single-sex competitive sports are specifically permitted by the Equality Act for any sport that uses anything to do with physical strength, stamina, or physique. And although it doesn't say it about school sports, it's perfectly acceptable, indeed wise, to offer separate sports for the two sexes once you hit puberty. And that's on health and safety grounds, but also on fairness to girls who would otherwise just find that they are runners-up in everything. And you might also want to do a sports program for one sex only in order to address a disadvantage or a different need or low participation. So even before puberty, you might decide, for example, to have girls only football because you find that boys just won't pass to the girls if it's a mixed sex group. Right, so that's the slide version of our full guide, which I do hope you download. And so now I'm going to call back my panelists, and I'm going to start by asking Shelley a question, because of course this is the second version of guidance that was first produced by Transgender Trend. So can you tell me how that guidance first came about?
Yes. Well, when Transgender Trend was set up in 2015, it's first it was set up to make sure that teaching in school was factual, as you say, fact-based teaching in school, and evidence-based teaching, evidence-based medicine in healthcare for gender distressed children. So those were the two sort of mission statements, if you like. And there was there were a lot of requests from parents. We heard from lots of parents who were saying that the school policies weren't working. They weren't getting the factual information they needed, and they were unhappy with what was happening in schools. So there were a group of parents, lawyers, teachers, and other professionals, child welfare officers, set about writing the first guide, which was called Supporting Gender Non-Conforming and Trans-Identifying Students in Schools. And it was first published as a downloadable resource on our website. And then we crowdfunded for it to be a printed edition. When we started crowdfunding, the crowdfunder was taken down for 6 days due for complaints from activists. So we knew we were up against quite a lot of opposition from those who put out and trans activist schools policies, but it was pretty nasty actually. Stonewall called it deeply damaging and told schools to bin it and shred it. And they called us an anti-trans group. But we got there, and the printed edition came out at the end of 2018, and we're now into our third edition. We've sent around 3,000 copies to schools or parents, and it's been downloaded tens of thousands of times. So it is a success. And I think, as most people know, Stephanie, who was behind it, was shortlisted for a prize for her work in bringing out that guide.
And also got a prize recently.
Yes, and recently she got an award in the Queen's Jubilee Honours list for her work with children. So yes, she has been recognised. But that first piece of guidance took a little bit of getting out. There's a lot of opposition, and I think we're a bit further on now in the discussions. But yes, those early days were difficult.
So speaking of being further along, Suella Braverman gave a speech, I think, in August. And I'm going to ask first Maya and then Alice to comment on that, because really I think she basically said everything that we said. But is that about right, Maya?
Yes, so on the 10th of August, Suella Braverman, when she was still the Attorney General, gave a speech at Policy Exchange, and it was quite wide-ranging, but there was a long section in it on schools, which we've clipped and put on the Sex Matters website if people want to download it and send it to their schools. It's very, very good. And she really said three things. One, she said what sex means and how separate sex rules work, and was in complete agreement with the things that we said. Two, she referenced Hilary Cass's work, and she talked about what to do when an individual child is gender questioning, and that is to follow medical advice, a full risk assessment, safeguarding, and taking into account the impact on other children before deciding whether to do anything different from the norm. And then thirdly, she said that schools should not be promoting gender ideology. So the idea that gender is subjective and binary approaches to sex are exclusionary. She gave those three messages very loudly and clearly. And as Shelley said, the transgender trend guidance, which was previously held as being controversial and should go in the bin, was reflected in what the Attorney General said on legal advice was what the Equality Act and schools' obligations on safeguarding tell them to do.
Alice, how was that received? And do you think that lawyers, education lawyers, sort of agree with her or hear the message loud and clear?
Well, I think I can only speak for myself as an education law barrister, but certainly I found it very refreshing to hear what the legal position was in black and white terms, that we had all been talking about in black and white terms for many years. And of course, this speech was given in the context of a lack of guidance, and now we've seen that there's a signal towards producing guidance. In circumstances when there's been years of uncertainty and difficulty, I would accept, certainly for my school clients, in how they manage children with these in these circumstances. And we have the new EHRC guidance, but that only covers services, and that will only cover a very small part of what some schools will be doing. So if they're providing an after-school club, for example. And this is an entirely different part of the Equality Act that we'll be looking at in terms of schools, Part 6. And I thought it was particularly striking that Braverman chose in her speech at Policy Exchange to focus on schools as a huge chunk of what she wanted to talk about, because she had said, and I quote, "This challenge is particularly acute in schools," and was particularly concerned about this misapprehension that schools are obliged by law to treat children according to their preference. And had also said, I think rightly, that there was that need for safeguarding to be the top priority alongside risk assessments and seeking of medical advice. And I also thought it was very important, and certainly with my non-lawyer clients and non-solicitor clients or other barristers, certainly in the expert perspective, so educational psychologists, psychiatrists, that sort of area. This is, at the moment, we have an increased understanding of the role of gender dysphoria, gender incongruence in having co-occurrence with other neurodevelopmental conditions like autism, like ADHD, and also when we have mental health problems as well. So I'm glad to see this emphasis on multidisciplinary approach. However, this has got to be seen in the wider context of support for young people in schools more broadly, in circumstances where it's very difficult to get help from CAMS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. The idea that you could have multidisciplinary team meetings with all of these people around the table to discuss this in circumstances where I can barely get this type of support for disabled children seems to me to be wildly optimistic. But I'm glad at least that there is an emphasis on the multidisciplinary approach and the medical approach. And of course, as Maya's highlighted, we're awaiting that full CAS report and looking at evidence-based approaches to supporting children who might be facing difficulties. The other thing that I think that is being welcomed across various sectors is this emphasis on the child's right to freedom of belief and freedom of thought, conscience, and so on, and recognising that the young person has those rights just as much as adults do, and that it applies to all children. So the child who's identifying as transgender and the child who isn't, it applies to everybody. And I think that that's certainly important too. But as I said, I'm dubious about the practicality of some of the advice in circumstances where we have limited funding for children in mental health crises, which is probably likely to include a large proportion of these young people. And then saying, well, there needs to be medical advice. Well, from who? In circumstances where we have limited supply of educational psychologists, clinical psychologists, child and adolescent psychiatrists. That's again where I think I would be dubious. But certainly I do think it's positive and I will be looking forward to seeing what the DFE produce, although I don't know when, and maybe someone else can enlighten me, when they intend to actually produce it, because of course we know that the EHRC said they were going to produce it in 2016, and of course we've never seen it, at least
Which I
not
think was
officially.
part of why Transgender Trend had to bring out their advice into this vacuum. Maya, I think you wanted to come in there on something Alice said.
Yes. Well, really, on that question about how Suella Braverman's advice has been received, one criticism that we've heard quite a lot from people is that she hasn't taken into account the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. So people have criticised that her advice, saying she's just assumed that that children are not covered by gender reassignment because they're not able to get a gender recognition certificate. But if you look at what she said, that's not what she said. What she has said is those children are covered by that protected characteristic, but that doesn't mean that they should be treated as if they've changed sex. It just means that they should be able to access education. They shouldn't be disadvantaged in accessing education, all parts of education, sports, public speaking, going on trips. Every part of school life should be open to them, but they haven't changed sex. And I think that's quite important. And that was the first negative response to her speech, and that's just inaccurate.
I'd like to go to Shelley now because, as you said, Transgender Trend started looking actually at medical issues for children. But I don't know if it was immediate or that you knew from the start that you were going to have to look at schools. But it has struck myself and Maya in the past year increasingly that schools and medicine on this are intertwined, that what happens in schools creates feelings about gender, and then the schools must deal with those feelings, but also those feelings go via medical either paradigms or indeed doctors as children go to see their GPs and so on. How do you see that loop, or do you see a loop with schools, medicine? How does that work for you?
Yes, there's a very definite link from the school's policies and resources that we're aware of and that parents write to us about that are going into schools, and it's a bit of a false dichotomy to say resources and policies. Quite often they're interlinked. For instance, Stonewall has schools policies that it puts out via its school champions scheme, and it has a curriculum, and they do give the same message that the child who's trans-identified should there are these medical pathways, and you can read that in the literature that they put out. So schools are getting it like that, and it's very hard to find resources that actually would take the approach that Sex Matters and Transgender Trend take with this latest resource we've done, which looks at this in a much more nuanced, rounded, holistic way. But schools aren't, of course, isolated. Children who go into school are seeing things online, and that's where they get a lot of it. So it's schools and the wider culture that feed into this notion that if you are unhappy with your body in any way, especially at puberty, there's something wrong with it. And the answer is that you can change it. And that girl who doesn't like dresses, makeup, and thinks it's all a bit silly and wants to go and, I don't know, do gaming, something like that, she is encouraged to think of those things as masculine rather, and see herself as a boy. And they'll get that message if their school is unlucky enough to have an LGBT organisation coming in teaching this sort of stuff, and they can go home and they're immediately going to be looking at that sort of thing online.
Alice, I'd like to get you to come in here because it's all very well us putting out this guidance, and indeed it's all very well the Attorney General or the DFE even putting out guidance. Our experience is that parents are scared to challenge their child's school. They don't want to enter into conflict, or their own child is in some way vulnerable, maybe going through these issues. And we have heard some shocking things. For example, somebody told me just this week that the school wrote to her to tell her that her child was trans identified. And she was warned by other parents that if she said anything at all about this, they would send the child to a gender affirming counsellor and they would refer her to social services. So that woman has not gone back to the school. She doesn't know what to do. Is there anything that you can advise parents as an education lawyer is a good approach if school, and this is in two situations, and I'm going to ask my other panelists about this as well. One is if your own child is coming up with these issues, but the other is just if you disagree with the way the school is, for example, organising spaces or what curriculum.
Of course. And no doubt that parent was in a very distressing situation where they found out this information. I think that's often a huge part of why these relationships with schools fall down, where that communication is. To answer those things in turn, so I think if you're a parent who's worried generally about a school's approach to, for example, PHSE or lessons and science lessons or whatever, you need to work out what it is that you are specifically challenging. So rather than secondhand, third-hand information about the actual content of those lessons, to find out what it is that is being taught and to actually get your hands on those materials. Bravin emphasised that you have the right under the Freedom of Information Act to access those materials if your school is a maintained school, so is effectively a public authority. So that doesn't cover independent schools, but for the vast majority of schools, you will be covered. And then if it's not supplied, you can then complain to the independent, the ICO or the Department for Education or both. And you can make that request by letter, email, fax, and so on. And they also have to make sure that they provide that to you as a parent in an accessible way. If you're yourself disabled, it has to be provided to you in a disabled way. They shouldn't be asking you for loads of money for it, because it's like the materials are not likely to be hundreds and hundreds of pages. But if they do, it should only be for photocopies or postage and so on. And you also want to check the copyright status of whatever you are sent as well. So before you start publishing the material online, saying, look what I've got for my children's school, just be wary of copyright issues that might be raised by the person who has produced, or the organisation that has produced those materials and probably charged a fee for their use. And so that's how you find out what to challenge point. And you could probably go for that option after asking politely, and then say, well, I'm going to have to ask for it formally. So informal first, then you can go down that formal route. And then the next question is who you want to challenge when you've got their content that you have a problem with. And there are a number of different organisations, a number of different stages that you might want to challenge. So, of course, it's the school itself, its own governing body. They will have their internal complaints processes that apply to that particular issue. You might find that they are marking their own homework as governors. Might not be particularly helpful or a really meaningful way to challenge that. So you might also want to go to the local authority if it's a school that's maintained by a local authority. A bit more difficult if it's an academy, but if it's an academy, you want to go to the people who are running the multi-academy trust, if it's a multi-academy trust. So the more senior figures in that trust you would want to be contacting. I've already mentioned the ICO, I've already mentioned the DFE, but you also can go to the other regulators. So the DFE is the regulator for education, but the other inspectorates, Ofsted, or the independent schools inspectorate as well, notify them of those concerns. And there have been recent judicial reviews against the DFE for failure to prevent unlawful local authorities from doing things, which was the Nigel and Sally Rowe claim. But if you're a parent, how to then challenge it, obviously it will depend on what you've got, but you would look at probably a judicial review type proceeding saying that the material is against government policy, against Equality Acts, having an indirectly discriminatory effect on disabled religious children, whatever it is. And interestingly, I noted in the Nigel Rowe case, which were Christian parents who was challenging Cornwall schools' guidance from that local authority. They instructed experts to demonstrate the harm that they said was being caused to children in those circumstances. We have more evidence, I think, through the CAS interim stuff. We'll probably have more, but that was certainly enough to cause, it seems, no doubt with other context in mind as well, but certainly caused a change from the DFE to commit to reforming and producing new policies and paying their costs. think it was £22,000 it cost.
Oh,
so
goodness.
that's how you would deal with it. I think if you were looking at the policies more broadly, if it's your own child, and particularly in the circumstances you've described where they've been blindsided by it, I would probably suggest that you would want to have just find out what's being talked about. So if you look online at the ICO website about how to make a subject access request on behalf of yourself and on behalf of your child, to see what is actually being talked about, what meetings are taking place without your knowledge. I think where there are those concerns that you might yourself want to consult with the local authority children's services and see if there's any kind of work that can be done together. That's really frightening for those parents in those circumstances. I totally see that. And they don't want to be seen at all like they are not safeguarding their child and don't have their child's best interests at heart. So if that sort of thing is being threatened, or if the local authority is starting to threaten or use language about not safeguarding the child, I would say legal representation is likely to be essential to protect yourself in those circumstances. Even if it's just advice, it's likely to be helpful to prevent that narrative from snowballing. So those, I think, are the kind of key ways. I totally recognise it's difficult, but I think at the moment we're armed by the fact that we have more people talking about the legal position in more black and white terms. And I think that parents relying on what Braverman has said, or schools relying on what Braverman has said, are in a stronger position now than they would have been had they not had that been said publicly.
So at Transgender Trend, and I think recently at Sex Matters, so I'll go to Shelley and then Maya, you hear from these parents all the time, maybe in a less formal legalistic way. Shelley, what have you learned at Transgender Trend helps or works?
Quite a lot of the parents who contact us have already gone through that process, that first process of challenging the policy or asking to see the guidance, and they have come up against a brick wall. I recognise all the stages that Alice is talking about, but parents who've already gone through the governors, and then, or if it's an academy, through the company that runs the academy, they quite often find that for instance, an academy will have some policy that is very, very trans activist influenced, if you like, and they just can't get anywhere beyond that. And the issue, again, the issue of parents and finding out that their child has been socially transitioned behind their back. Those are very, very distressing cases. I mean, parents are really writing to us and to other groups in a state of real anxiety and sort of terror in some ways that they're going to be reported, as Alice was saying, for some form of neglect. And it is important that the message gets out there that the schools safeguarding, keeping children safe in education, which is legislation, actually does say that parents are the main, they are the main people to be involved in the safeguarding of children. And we need to get when the DFE guidance comes out, we're hoping that will actually be much more in the forefront. But what you can do at that stage when it's happened, it's quite hard. Because you're just running to catch up, and parents who've got a child in a school where the policy is, say, influenced by a group like All Sorts, Stonewall, All About Us, any of these organisations that come up with, it's basically always the same policy, but the damage in a way has been done. That is the problem. It's quite hard to get that message over to government sometimes, just the urgency of it. And being told then Ofsted is the next port of call, next person to complain to, again, is problematic because it all takes time. Your child, meanwhile, is having to go into school every day. So action
To
is
see if Maya
needed.
has anything that she wants to come in with, and I know Alice wants to come in again then. So Maya, what would you add before I return to Alice?
Yes, I mean we're contacted more and more by parents. I think that there's sort of two kinds of parents that I come across. One is the ones who are very distressed and worried, who are the ones who turn up in our inbox. But more and more, there are parents who I bump into on the street or in the gym or at a conference, or any conversation that you're having with a group of parents. One of them will say, oh, my child is transgender, or my child is non-binary, and some of those parents are not worried, and maybe less worried than they should be, about what this means. Um, and both those sets of parents, obviously, they want to keep the door open with their child. They don't want to get into a conflict with their child. They don't want to alienate them or become alienated from them. But they need to understand the risk and the issues that this pathway involves. And the school is often saying to them, it's fine, it's not, your child is now a boy or a girl. So one thing I think is to read the evidence. And Sex Matters is putting out a new paper on the evidence on gender dysphoric, a sort of summary of the evidence on gender dysphoric teenagers. And also signposting to things from Transgender Trend and GenSpect and others who've been working on this. So, one is read the evidence. I think it's really important to get support from other parents who are going through this. And so, there are self-help groups, support groups that have sprung up, like the Bayswater group and Our Duty, which you can also find on the internet. And then I think thirdly is sort of allies. If you can find allies in the school whose children are maybe not going through this, but who are concerned about the issues more broadly. Because obviously, a parent whose child is going through this, their relationship with the school is much more delicate than a parent who just wants to talk about rights and wants to talk about whole school policies. And I think in the end, it's going to make things easier for parents of children who are going through distress if the school has clear policies. If there's less room for negotiation, then there's less room for conflict between the parent and child. If they're just able to say, no, look, the school says no, and the school says no because they're considering other children, that also helps that child to then understand that they're not able to change sex by declaring that they have, and then hopefully give them the time and the space to explore what are the reasons they're feeling that way.
Alice, I know you want to say something about negligence.
Yeah, so very briefly, it was very interesting, I thought, that Braverman mentioned negligence, because I have to say, I thought that was a bit of a stretch, that we might be starting to see schools sued for negligence. But I think if you can say, in the context of an evidence base, particularly if Sex Matters is, for example, publishing and making schools aware of the actual evidence base, the medical evidence base for the things that are being put in place, then it's possible to argue that these schools are acting in a way that falls below the standards to be expected of that school, and that has then arguably caused harm to that child, for which there might be a personal injury claim. Or if you're in an independent school, that there might be a breach of contract claim where the school has fallen below those standards to be expected, and that's a breach of an implied term in the contract to perform that service with a good degree of care and skill, in circumstances where now we have guidance out there that is to better inform schools. So if they don't follow it, if they don't follow Keeping Children Safe in Education, they don't follow working together, they don't follow the sexual violence guidance on the DfE, they don't follow what is about to come out from the DfE, that is more problematic for the school. And I thought at first that was a bit of a stretch, but it might be, particularly in the context where we might start to see more clinical negligence claims, where we do start to look at reasonableness in that context, that we may start seeing schools having to worry a little bit more about potential negligence actions against them. Very difficult claims to bring, but not impossible to think about.
That's really interesting that I hadn't picked up on that at all. Okay, for the rest of this discussion, what I'd like to do is, lots of the questions have focused very particularly on basically freedom of speech. It's people saying, do you have to respect children's pronouns? do children have to respect teachers' pronouns? One of the people in the audience has a trans-identified teaching assistant in the school. What happens if a child misgenders that person? Maybe, Maya, I could start with you. I mean, I don't think we have law really, or very good, clear guidance on the subject.
No, and I think the answer is, it's better to deal with the conflict and deal with the question up front rather than wait for it to boil over. To go and speak to the school and to say, this is my belief or this is my child's belief. What are you going to do to accommodate them, rather than wait, and particularly with a situation between children where it can become bullying. So we say that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. There are no particular words that are outlawed, but any words could be used for bullying. And so you want to make sure that the school is protecting that child from being bullied, protecting other children from being bullied, and protecting their freedom of speech. And so you want to, I think, put that question to the school up front rather than wait for it to become a problem, at which point, there's upset and hurt on all sides.
Alice, what do you think?
Where I think there is some useful guidance is in the employment law context. There was a useful blog that Naomi Cunningham did on the ACAS guidance, which basically said it's no big deal. You can put pronouns in your bios or pronouns in your email signatures, and that was cut apart in one of her usual blogs. The guidance doesn't really exist for children in schools, and certainly where I have seen it come up in practical cases is where children who are neurodiverse have used the wrong pronouns for the person in question, and that's where it can get quite difficult when that person thinks that they're using honest language to describe something, and then they are disciplined for being honest from their perspective about it. So I think schools need to be really mindful of the interplay between disability discrimination, as well as looking at freedom of speech issues that arise out of Maya's case and the McCarrath case as well, the other case, which is a bit trickier, which again Naomi Cunningham talks about in her blog in the employment sector. But as far as I'm aware, there's no case law yet on the context of pronoun use in schools, so we'd have to watch out for that and see how that is then used.
So if I could ask you a specific question though, Alice, I mean, one of the places that people want to correctly sex somebody, so this may not actually be about pronouns, but just about saying that's a boy or that's a man or that's a girl, is when they're talking about things like sports or facilities or so on. So I've seen trans inclusion policies that make clear that any reference to a trans identified child's actual sex will be counted as harassment. But then how can you say there was a boy in the girls' changing room? Like, it seems to me that is that more clear cut, that you would have to be able to be allowed to say that.
Yes, I think so. And I don't actually think that anyone is suggesting that describing something like that would lead to extreme sanctions. Perhaps it is,
They are,
which is
I'm
worrying.
afraid.
I know, which is worrying. I think that there is difficulty. I mean, there's things like I spoke on in the last time we did this talk about, for example, the school admissions arrangements, the school registration regulations, where sex is recorded, needs to be recorded as sex, where we have other ways in which sex of the pupil is recorded as such in paperwork relating to schools. But I can see some real difficulty about those young people if they are being disciplined for using language to describe things that have in fact happened, and then using their own version of the truth of what they think happened by saying there was a boy in the girls' changing room. I would probably say that if there is a sanction arising from that is probably capable of amounting to unfavourable treatment or one of the other kind of limbs of a discrimination claim. Possibly, we'll have to look at the facts of what's exactly happened. But if they've been subject to a detriment as a consequence of saying something, so they've been sanctioned for saying something that is a protected belief issue, then there may be something that they can you can raise a legitimate Equality Act claim for. And that I think.
I mean, maybe Shelley, I could ask you about the safeguarding implications of this. I mean, there's a strong link between safeguarding and being able to speak the truth as you see it.
Absolutely, there is, and it takes me back to the resources section, the resources aspect of it. That so many resources do contain admonitions to teachers to teach. Some girls have vulvas, some boys have penises. So if at that classroom level, children are not being taught properly about what sex is and that sex is binary and immutable, then it is easier for these other policies about pronoun use to be enforced. And I would like to see any school look at everything in the round and say, what are we actually teaching children? And yes, it is a safeguarding thing, absolutely. If a girl cannot say she is a girl in primary school, cannot talk about needing to go to the loo because she has a period, because she's confused as to even whether, it's only girls who have them. There are just so many problems that arise from not being truthful with children. And I think the pronoun question is tricky. But if you start off from being the truthful position that you tell children that you're a boy or a girl and you can't change sex, and if so and so feels they're a boy, you should be kind to them and you shouldn't tease them or bully them. But uh, they are a boy and they've not changed sex just because they've changed their name or grown their hair. So it's truthfulness with children in the actual implementation of in dealing with the pronoun issue. I think that's crucial.
In a minute, I'm going to hand back to Maya to give a little bit about sex matters, but I wondered if each of you might like to just, if there was one message that you would like to give on this subject, just in a few sentences, that are the current issues that you were thinking about. Maya, I'm going to jump on you first. What would you want to say at the end of this webinar?
I think on one hand, we've come so far from where we were in 2015, 2016, where there was no clear guidance, there was no clarity about the law, and it was very dangerous for people to talk about this. So that's good news. But I think we're seeing an explosion of this social contagion of children developing gender dysphoria from nowhere, and schools are not yet ready to understand how to deal with it. So on one hand, we're sort of accelerating towards better solutions that protect all children, but on the other hand, the challenge is getting much bigger, much faster. So if the Department for Education is watching, they need to get on with getting their guidance out and working with CAS and seeing this link between schools and the NHS and the medical system.
And Shelley, what would you take away as a message?
Well, I think we should, as Maya said, reference CAS, we should be enormously optimistic about what Hilary Cass is going to be looking at in the future. She is going to be looking at the role of schools and how they fit into the whole gender healthcare for young people, and that. So we should look forward to that. I think, yes, things have improved somewhat. Parents are better informed. We get parents coming to us who've already read things, and they come with really good questions. I think the Department for Education guidance is needed really quite urgently, and I'd like to see them give a little bit of time and thought to how that it gets disseminated as well. I think it will be up to all our groups to make sure that the message gets through that this will be fair, it will be equal, and it will be good for both gender non-conforming, trans-identified children and children who aren't, but needs a bit of government backing to do that. I mean, if Suella Braverman's speech indicates the direction of travel, I think that will be a good thing.
And before I come to Alice, I'd just like to say an answer to a question. There's a very short answer. Yes, we do all work together. Transgender Trends, Safe Schools Alliance, Sex Matters, we do all work together all the time. Alice, what's your takeaway?
I think what would be really helpful, certainly from my perspective, is if more education lawyers would speak up about this, because I know of a handful that are speaking about it in the higher education sector, and I know of a handful who are speaking about it from the safeguarding side, the child safeguarding side, but there's very few who are speaking about this particular issue, particularly in a context where transgender discrimination in schools is both academically interesting, but also incredibly important and an acutely difficult problem right now. So it would be good if it was spoken about more, with less vitriol and less sort of mudslinging, actually more interest in how to solve it, how to make this better, how to design risk assessments for children in these circumstances, how to make sure those multidisciplinary team meetings actually work in practice. And I think I would certainly like to see a little bit more collaboration with other members of the legal community in this particular, I appreciate it's a very niche field, but in this particular legal community, to discuss how to make it better for all children.
That's a great piece of advice. Okay, so I'm going to say farewell to our audience on behalf of myself, Shelley, and Alice, and I'm going to hand over to Maya just for the very last few minutes of this webinar, just to tell you a bit about what Sex Matters is up to, and she'll close the session off. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you, Helen. So, Sex Matters is a human rights organisation. We advocate for clarity on sex in law and policy in order to protect everyone's rights. This webinar and the guide is an example of that approach. We apply the human rights framework, which protects everyone. We use clear language, and we seek to resolve the conflicts of rights in areas where sex matters. We do this by undertaking research, developing materials, doing trainings and webinars like this, and talking to policymakers, politicians, and the media. We mainly use the law as it stands, but in places where it's unclear or problematic, we will seek to try and change it through democratic processes. We're applying this same approach in other areas, so single-sex services, to the justice system, and helping people to understand their rights at work, not to be discriminated for being gender critical. May the Forstater be with you, as they say. Next slide. If you're already a supporter, thank you so much. It's only with your support that we're able to do what we do. And if you're not already a supporter, we really hope that you'll become one. Individual supporters giving us £5, £10, £30 a month is the main part of what allows Sex Matters to do what it does. You can use the little QR code or go to www.sex-matters.org/donate. And if you can see the picture, we have new merch, which we send to people who support us on a regular basis. And the idea is that that's also a conversation starter. If you're on a Zoom call or at the shops, you're signalling that you are gender critical and you are willing to talk about it. So the next slide. We also welcome one-off donations. Every little helps. We don't charge for these webinars, but we hope if people find them useful, they will support us. And then, as I promised, we would give a sneak peek of what we're doing next on the next slide. So, as Helen said, this guidance is really for schools, and we've been working to encourage parents to send the guidance to their schools, but we are now also developing materials particularly for parents. And so that's for those two groups of parents that we talked about. One, those who are generally concerned about this issue in their school and concerned about the whole school rules, and the other, parents who need a first aid kit, who are facing this crisis because their child has just come home and said they're trans identified. And they don't know where to turn. So those are two quite different groups of parents, and we're producing materials for both of those groups in the coming weeks and months. So the final slide, next slide, is just to say thank you for watching and supporting. This video will be on YouTube this evening. Please share it with your friends, with your colleagues, and with your child's school. Whether you support us financially or not, please join our email list, and that way you'll hear about future webinars. Thank you.